books aren't being stolen at random. They're being shelved.
The woman in the signed first editions. Absence had a shape. Tessa Quill noticed it before the collector did, because she made a living noticing what other people called nothing and then naming it until it became news. The library in the Mayfair townhouse was built to flatter itself. Dark wood, warm lamps, shelves arranged in the kind of order that implied money had paid for time. The books were displayed like calm trophies. A glass case stood against one wall, the lock polished until it looked ceremonial. The empty space inside it was not large. It wasn't dramatic. It was the size of a single volume, a gap between two other books that had not moved. A missing tooth. The collector, Dr. Penrose, kept talking as if the room was intact. He circled the case with a kind of controlled indignation, describing how no door had been forced, how the alarm system had not registered anything unusual, how the cleaning staff had been vetted, how his home insurance was as robust as one can reasonably be. Tessa nodded, recording the rhythm of his outrage. She had heard it before in different rooms, spoken by people who didn't mind losing money as long as they didn't lose dignity. She waited until he paused for breath and then asked to see the remaining books. He unlocked the case with a key that hung on a chain inside his cardigan, a habit that belonged to a previous century. He opened the glass door. The case smelled faintly of polish and the dry sweetness of paper that had been protected from air too long. Tessa leaned in. The missing book's neighbors were signed first editions, one in pale blue cloth, one in worn leather. The stolen one had been a modern volume, the kind that fetched more when the author was still alive and in the awkward phase between lauded and mythologized. "Which title?" she asked. Penrose said it, a name that meant nothing to Tessa beyond the price tag it would have carried at auction. He said it like a person naming a pet that had been taken. "And you didn't notice until this morning," she said. "I don't inspect the case daily," he snapped, then softened, remembering he'd invited her. "I had a friend here last week, a dinner. A few of us wandered in here afterward, as people do." "What kind of people?" Tessa asked, already guessing. Penrose's expression turned faintly defensive. "Writers, critics, editors, collectors and their satellites, all orbiting the same bright need to be close to something the rest of the world couldn't touch." Tessa asked to see the end papers of the books still in the case. Penrose blinked, surprised, but allowed it. She wore thin cotton gloves because it kept clients calm, not because her skin would ruin paper. She lifted the closest volume and opened it carefully. The end paper was clean, no fox, no key, no mark. She opened the next, nothing. She worked down the row with the patient thoroughness that came from having learned that patterns hid in repetition. Halfway through, she found it. A small drawing, no larger than her thumbnail, tucked near the inner hinge where the paper met the board. It was done in a pencil line so light it almost disappeared unless the lamp hit it at an angle. A fox in profile, a key clenched between its teeth. Tessa felt a precise shift in her focus, like a camera lens finding its point. She didn't react outwardly. She simply turned the book slightly, confirming it wasn't a trick of fibers. The line was there, deliberate, practiced. Penrose leaned over her shoulder, curious. "What is that?" "A calling card," Tessa said, voice neutral. Penrose made a sound of disgust. "They vandalized my books?" "They marked them," Tessa corrected, still calm. "Vandalism is messy. This is tidy." She checked 2 more volumes. The fox and key appeared again, drawn in the same faint hand, in the same location, with the same careful restraint. Whoever had done it hadn't wanted the owners to see. They'd wanted someone else to know which books to take. Penrose's outrage changed flavor. It gained a new ingredient: vulnerability. People could tolerate theft better than they could tolerate the idea that they'd been handled. Tessa asked a final question before she left. Had Penrose recently taken any of these books out of the case? Had he shown them to anyone? Had he sent any away for valuation, repair, or sale? Penrose hesitated, then admitted that a week ago he'd had a parcel returned from a small shop near Charing Cross. A minor purchase, nothing of consequence. But it had prompted him to pull a few signed editions out and admire them, a private ritual after an evening of social noise. "A shop?" Tessa asked. Penrose named it without emphasis, as if it were just another errand. Bramble and Company. Tessa wrote it down anyway. When she stepped back onto the Mayfair pavement, the air smelled of rain and expensive perfume. Her phone buzzed with an editor's reminder that she owed copy by Monday. Tessa looked at the note in her pocket, FOX plus KEY, and felt the first real spark of interest. This wasn't a single theft. It was a method, and methods made stories. She spent the next 3 days moving through other people's rooms. A townhouse in Hampstead with a library that looked curated for photographs. Pale wood, clean lines, a wall of spines arranged by color because aesthetics sometimes beat sense. The owner, a television producer, spoke with the irritated exhaustion of someone used to winning arguments. Her signed first editions had disappeared from a locked cabinet. No forced entry, no alarm. A fox and key drawn in faint pencil on 3 untouched books. A cluttered flat in Deptford where the shelves were bowed and the books were stacked in double rows. The owner, a retired teacher, had a signed first edition of a poet no one collected for money, but everyone collected for grief. It had vanished from her bedside table. The fox and key sat in the end paper of a different book on her shelf, as if the thief had left a note. You had more than one thing worth taking. A studio in Dalston where a young novelist kept her first editions in a suitcase under the bed because she didn't trust landlords. The suitcase had been opened. Only the signed books were gone. The fox and key appeared inside a paperback she hadn't touched in years. Every scene had the same quiet oddity. No mess, no panic in the room itself. The owners supplied the drama because owners always did. The thefts behaved like a librarian's work, selective, precise, almost respectful. Whoever was taking these books wasn't breaking into rooms, they were editing them. And every owner, when Tessa asked about recent contact with any bookshops, mentioned the same place near Charing Cross. Sometimes they'd visited it, sometimes they'd received a parcel from it, a small purchase, a special order, a book recommended by the staff. The kind of transaction people didn't remember until you asked them twice. The pattern became difficult to ignore. Tessa pinned names and dates to a corkboard in her flat. She drew a map of London on a scrap of paper and marked the theft locations. They did not form an obvious route, no neat circle, no line. The thief wasn't traveling geographically. They were traveling categorically. Signed first editions. Not necessarily the most valuable. Not necessarily the rarest, but always signed. Always with the fox and key hidden inside the covers. Tessa thought about signatures. A signature was a name written by hand, a claim of presence. In rare book circles, it was treated as magic. The ink itself could triple a book's value, as if the writer had left behind a spark of their authority for the collector to own. Tessa didn't believe in magic. She believed in markets, but she also believed in patterns. Her cynical brain offered a tidy explanation, a theft ring using a small shop as a scouting ground. Bramble and Company might be providing valuations, handling consignments, noting which customers mentioned their private collections. The fox and key might be their code, a way to mark targets during visits, browse a shelf, compliment the collection, draw a tiny symbol in pencil where nobody noticed, and then return later with a key copied from a photograph of a keychain left on a counter. A bland explanation, plausible, publishable, and yet the pencil marks were too consistent to be casual. Whoever drew them used the same pressure, the same line, the same placement. It felt less like opportunistic scrawling and more like a practiced ritual. Tessa contacted a police acquaintance in the art and antiques unit, a woman who owed her a favor after Tessa had chosen not to print a story that would have made her look incompetent. The detective offered a list of reported thefts and a weary warning not to get close enough to be useful. The list confirmed what Tessa had already sensed. The thefts were accelerating, and the selection made no immediate financial sense. Some stolen books were worth 5 figures, others barely crossed 1,000. A ring motivated purely by money would have taken more, not less. It would have emptied cabinets. It would have taken jewelry while it was there. This thief wanted specific objects. Chapters. Tessa wrote the word on her corkboard without knowing why. Then she gathered her notebook, her phone, and her best skeptical expression, and went to the shop near Charing Cross that kept appearing like a refrain. Bramble and Company was smaller than she expected. She'd pictured a shop with gleaming glass, curated displays, a rare book room in the back, and staff who spoke in hushed reverence. Instead, she found a narrow, stubborn space that looked like it had refused to modernize out of spite. Books were stacked too high and shelved too tightly. A ladder leaned against a shelf as if it had been waiting since the 1980s. The air smelled of dust, glue, and a faint trace of citrus that made the place feel oddly domestic. The bell above the door made a clean sound when she entered. Behind the counter stood a young woman with dark hair pinned back and eyes that moved quickly, taking in Tessa's face, her posture, the way she held her notebook like a warrant. The woman's expression changed, subtle but unmistakable from customer-neutral to recognition. "You're the one who wrote that piece about the last sanctuaries," she said. Tessa paused. She didn't need to ask which piece. She'd written it 2 years ago for a glossy weekend supplement, an affectionate, slightly mocking profile of independent bookshops surviving in a city that would rather sell candles shaped like books than actual books. She'd interviewed 3 owners, taken photos of shelves, quoted a staff member who'd said something quietly earnest about returns being a kind of second chance. Tessa had polished that line into something cuter for print. She'd made it sound like marketing. The assistant's tone now suggested she hadn't appreciated that. "Tessa Quill," Tessa said, offering her name as currency. "Yes, that was me." The assistant didn't smile. "Ivy," she said, as if names mattered here in a way Tessa hadn't yet measured. "You didn't mention we had a mold problem." Tessa blinked, then almost laughed. Ivy's stare made the laugh reconsider itself and turn into a nod. "Fair," Tessa said. "I edited for tone." Ivy's gaze held hers a moment longer, then shifted to the notebook. "You're not here for a profile," she said. "No," Tessa replied. "I'm here because people keep getting robbed." Ivy didn't flinch at the word. She glanced quickly toward the back corridor as if the building itself might be listening. Before she could answer, a man emerged from behind a curtain near the desk area. He had the look of someone who lived among paper, ink-stained fingers, glasses that sat low on his nose, a posture that suggested he expected disappointment from everything. Gideon Bramble. Tessa recognized him from her article photo, the same face but harder now, as if 2 more years had taught him nothing except to expect intrusion. His gaze took her in with immediate dislike. "We're closed," he said, though the open sign on the door disagreed. "I'm not here to browse," Tessa said. "I'm a journalist." Gideon's mouth compressed. "Then you're definitely not here to browse." Tessa kept her voice steady. She'd learned that aggression was often a shield for a softer fear, but she also knew some men were simply allergic to being questioned. "I'm investigating a rare book theft ring," she said. "Signed first editions are disappearing. The thief leaves a tiny fox holding a key drawn inside the books. The owners I've spoken to all have one thing in common." Gideon's eyes narrowed slightly. "They have money," he said. "They've been in contact with your shop," Tessa replied. The space between them sharpened. Gideon didn't deny it. He simply looked at Ivy as if silently instructing her to retreat. Ivy didn't move. "We sell books," Gideon said. "People buy them. That isn't a conspiracy." "I'm not accusing you of theft," Tessa said, though her notebook was ready if he gave her reason. "I'm asking whether anyone has been in your shop drawing that symbol in pencil." Gideon's expression didn't change much, but something in his eyes went colder, like a shutter dropping inside the face. "No," he said. Tessa watched him closely. "That was fast," she noted. "I don't need time to answer nonsense," Gideon replied. Tessa's cynicism wanted to label him guilty immediately. Her better instinct, trained by years of listening to liars, noticed that Gideon didn't look like a man enjoying a secret. He looked like a man holding something he didn't want to hold. She shifted slightly, and her gaze caught on something behind the counter. A photograph, half hidden behind a stack of receipts and an old mug. It was black and white, curled at the corners. She couldn't see it clearly from where she stood, but she saw enough. A younger Gideon behind the same counter, the same shelves behind him. Another figure beside him, female, hair tied back, laughing at something outside the frame. The shop sign visible through the window. The photo looked older than Gideon's stated age should have allowed. Tessa didn't comment on it yet. She let it sit in her mind like a bookmark. She returned to the thefts. "Do you keep records of rare book sales?" she asked. Gideon's eyes hardened. "We keep sales records," he said. "We don't provide them to journalists." "I'm not asking for customer details," Tessa said. "I'm asking whether you've seen that fox and key mark." Gideon's jaw worked, a small movement that suggested restraint rather than indifference. "No," he repeated. Tessa had learned how to press without raising her voice. "The pencil is specific," she said. "Hard lead. The line is faint. It's drawn in the same place every time, near the hinge on the end paper. Whoever is doing it knows books. They're not scribbling on title pages." Gideon's gaze flicked, almost imperceptible, to Ivy. Ivy's hands were flat on the counter, but her fingers shifted slightly as if she were grounding herself. Tessa watched that exchange. She didn't understand it yet, but it told her she was not the only one noticing patterns. She tried another angle. "Some of the victims told me they received parcels from this shop shortly before their books vanished," she said. "Can you tell me why?" Gideon's expression sharpened into something close to contempt. "People receive parcels from us because they order books," he said. "If they want to blame us for being a shop, they can do it without your help." Tessa nodded, as if accepting that, then asked the question she knew would sting. "How long have you owned Bramble and Company?" Gideon's eyes narrowed. "Long enough," he said. Tessa let her gaze drift again to the old photograph behind the counter, just a fraction. "Because it looks like you've been behind that counter longer than your business registration suggests," she said. The air in the shop changed, not dramatically, no gust, no crash, but the way tension changes when a rope is pulled to its limit. Gideon's voice dropped. "Don't," he said. Tessa felt something like satisfaction and immediately distrusted it. Satisfaction was how journalists convinced themselves they were hunting truth rather than winning. "I'm only asking because the pattern of these thefts behaves like something curated," she said. "Like someone assembling a set." Gideon stared at her with a look that made her skin prickle. Not fear, not anger, something older. A look like recognition mixed with warning. Then, finally, he spoke a sentence that sounded rehearsed, as if he'd used it before and hated that he needed it now. "Some stories are safer unopened," Gideon said. The words landed in the shop like a hand placed flat on a book cover, not violent, but firm. Tessa wrote them down anyway. Ivy's gaze met hers briefly. There was an expression there that Tessa couldn't decode. Something between apology and insistence, as if Ivy wanted Tessa to leave and also wanted her to stay. Tessa made a decision. She stepped closer to the counter, lowering her voice. "If you're not involved," she said, "help me stop whoever is." Gideon's eyes hardened again. "You don't stop this kind of thing by printing it," he said. "You feed it." Tessa felt annoyance spark. "I'm not writing a ghost story," she said. "I'm writing about theft." Gideon leaned in slightly, and for a moment his fatigue showed through the hostility. "You think theft is only about money," he said. "Sometimes it's about ownership. Sometimes it's about access." His voice went quieter. "Sometimes it's about making a door out of paper." Tessa held still. She didn't know whether he was warning her about a metaphor or confessing something stranger. She asked one final question. "Can I see your ledger?" she said. Gideon's laugh was short and empty. "No," he said, "and you should leave." Tessa could have argued. She could have tried to charm Ivy into helping her. She could have stood there and forced a scene in front of browsing customers. Instead, she did what she did best. She left while she still had leverage in the form of mystery. As she walked toward the door, Ivy spoke quietly behind her. "Don't get yourself stamped," Ivy said. Tessa paused with her hand on the handle. "Stamped?" she asked. Ivy didn't explain. Gideon's voice cut in, sharper. "Ivy." Tessa glanced back once more, letting her eyes flick to the photograph behind the till. The younger Gideon, the laughing woman, the shop sign through the window. Then she stepped out into the street, the bell ringing behind her like a punctuation mark. Outside, London kept its usual pace. Inside Tessa's mind, the fox and key turned slightly, like a symbol trying to become a sentence. That evening, Tessa did what she always did when a person refused information. She went around them. She searched the company's house records. Bramble and Company had been registered under Gideon's name in the early 2000s. Prior to that, the shop existed under a different legal entity, same address, different owner. A man named Harcourt something, then another name, then a gap in paperwork that looked like a missing page. Gaps interested her more than names. She searched old business directories. Bramble and Company appeared in print decades earlier, always in the same narrow lane off Charing Cross. Always described as booksellers, without any fancy adjectives. The kind of place that survived by being useful rather than fashionable. She searched for the fox and key symbol online and found nothing meaningful. Some heraldry, a pub sign, an illustration in a children's book. No consistent mark, no obvious organization. She printed photographs of the stolen books from auction listings and collector forums. She enlarged the end paper marks where victims had sent her images. The fox and key drawings were consistent, down to the angle of the fox's tail and the way the key's bow was shaded. The pencil line was unusually pale. She called a friend who worked in print restoration at a museum, the kind of friend you acquired by writing polite articles about underpaid expertise. The friend didn't want to be quoted, but offered one useful fact. That kind of faint, clean mark was usually made with a hard graphite pencil, 2H or harder, favored by conservators because it didn't smear and could be erased without scarring paper if you were careful. Not the pencil of a casual thief, the pencil of someone who handled books for a living. Tessa wrote conservation lead in her notebook and circled it. Then she looked at her corkboard again. The locations, the dates, the owners, the repeated mention of Bramble and Company. The thefts looked less like opportunism now and more like a sequence. A set of moves arranged so that each owner's private library became a stage for the same quiet gesture. A fox, a key, and then a book removed from the shelf as if a hand had simply decided it belonged elsewhere. Tessa's editor texted her, "Any luck? Need angle by Friday." Tessa stared at the message. Angle by Friday. The phrase innocuous brushed her mind in a way that made it itch, as if it had been penciled into the margin of something she hadn't read. She shook it off. Friday. She had a deadline, and deadlines were doors of their own. The next morning she visited a rare book dealer in St. James's, who owed her an interview and disliked collectors enough to talk freely. He confirmed the thefts were circulating quietly through the trade like gossip with teeth. He also confirmed something that made her pause. The stolen books were not random in their literary significance. They were not simply expensive, they were thematic. "They're all about returns, aren't they?" the dealer said, then caught himself and scoffed, as if embarrassed by having noticed. Not returns in the boring sense, returns as in coming back, revisions, second chances, all that. Tessa looked down at her notes, then at the list of stolen titles. She hadn't noticed that, and she disliked noticing it now. She asked the dealer whether any of the victims had brought their books to him for valuation. "No," he said, "but a couple mentioned that little shop near Charing Cross, Bramble, old-fashioned place, doesn't do fairs." "Do you know the owner?" Tessa asked. The dealer hesitated, then shrugged. "Bramble's been there forever. Changed hands on paper, maybe, but the shop feels like it remembers every set of hands that tried to run it." He frowned. "There's a story there." Tessa didn't ask what story. Dealers told stories the way fishermen told tales, always with a hook, rarely with proof. But she left with a new detail. A few of the stolen books had been signed not only with the author's name, but with dedications that referenced doors, keys, gaps, writers joking perhaps, or something else. Tessa went home and reread the victims' messages. She scanned their photos again, zooming in on inscriptions. One dedication read, "To the next reader, mind the gap." Another, for L, who knows where the doors are. A third, stranger, return by Friday. Don't be late. Collectors often bought signed books at events where authors improvised dedications on autopilot. Writers made jokes, flirted, scribbled phrases that sounded profound in the moment, and then vanished into paper. But if a thief was choosing which books to steal, dedications were more than ink. Dedications were intent made visible. Tessa felt her cynicism falter, not into belief, but into caution. By Thursday, she'd convinced herself she needed one more expert, someone who understood paper not as luxury, but as structure. She found the name through a museum contact, Marion Lark, bookbinder, East London, known for work that was invisible in the right way. Tessa took the overground to Hackney Wick and walked through a corridor of converted warehouses that smelled of damp concrete and brewing coffee. Marion's unit was at the end, behind a door that required a firm shove. Inside, the workshop was quiet in a way that made Tessa lower her voice automatically. Tools were arranged with a severity that suggested the binder disliked improvisation. A standing press took up one corner like a patient animal. Shelves held volumes in various states of disrepair. Marion Lark looked up from her bench without standing. Her face held the calm neutrality of someone who'd learned to keep emotion out of her hands. Tessa introduced herself, offered her credentials, explained the theft ring. Marion listened without nodding, the way a professional listened when deciding whether a job was worth the fuss. When Tessa mentioned the fox and key symbol, Marion's eyes changed. A small shift, but enough that Tessa saw it. Recognition and something like irritation. "You've seen it," Tessa said, more statement than question. Marion didn't answer immediately. She set her tool down with deliberate care, as if making sure the workshop stayed in order, even if the conversation didn't. "I've seen worse," Marion said finally. Tessa took out a printed photo of the end paper mark and placed it on the bench. "The pencil is specific," she said. "Hard lead, conservator's hand. Does that look familiar to you?" Marion glanced at it and then looked away, as if eye contact with the symbol invited it to become more real. "You're asking me if I drew it," Marion said. "I'm asking if you know who would," Tessa replied. Marion's mouth pulled into a thin line. "People who like control," she said. "People who believe books are obedient." Tessa waited. Marion sighed, as if annoyed at herself. "Hard graphite," she said, almost to herself. "Probably a 3H light touch. A person who knows paper fibers." "A binder," Tessa said. "A binder," Marion agreed, not happily. "Or a restorer, or someone who watches binders and copies them." Tessa leaned in slightly. "Have you had any unusual commissions from Bramble and Company?" she asked. Marion's gaze flicked up sharply. "You've been to Bramble," she said. "Yes," Tessa replied. "And the owner looked like he wanted to set me on fire without leaving marks." Marion's expression didn't change, but something in her posture shifted, like a door bolt sliding halfway. "I don't discuss clients," Marion said. Tessa nodded. "Then I'll ask differently," she said. "Is Gideon Bramble involved in something that would make a thief use his shop as a waypoint?" Marion's laugh was short and humorless. "Involved," she repeated. "Everyone's involved when they touch the wrong book." That was not an answer, but it wasn't a denial either. Tessa picked up on the phrase, "touch the wrong book." "There's a specific book, isn't there?" she asked. Marion's eyes sharpened. For a moment, Tessa thought Marion might throw her out. Instead, Marion stared at the photo of the fox and key symbol and said, "If you publish a story about this, you'll attract attention you can't edit." Tessa kept her voice steady. "Attention is literally my job," she said. Marion looked at her with a quiet contempt, reserved for people who treated risk as content. Then, as if conceding a fraction, Marion said, There are people who collect books the way other people collect leverage. Tessa's pen paused. And these people are stealing signed first editions, she said. Marion shrugged slightly. Signatures are names, she said. Names are anchors. People with anchor fetishes do strange things. Tessa almost smiled at the phrase. Anchor fetishes was the kind of line she'd usually steal for an article, but it carried too much private anger to be cute. She asked one final thing. Do you know the fox and key mark from anywhere? She said. Marion looked away. Yes, she said, and nothing more. Tessa left Marion's workshop with less than she wanted and more than she'd arrived with, a sense that her tidy explanation was dissolving. The theft ring was not just an economic crime, it had ideology, it had ritual. And ritual did not respond well to headlines. That afternoon she returned to Bramble and Company. Not because Gideon had invited her, and not because she expected honesty, because she had learned over years that the best lies needed props. Gideon's hostility felt less like a man protecting a scam and more like a man protecting a wound. The bell chimed when she entered. Ivy was behind the counter again, sleeves pushed up, eyes alert. Her expression held a resigned kind of recognition. "You're back," Ivy said. Tessa nodded. "I'm stubborn," she replied. Ivy's gaze flicked toward the back curtain. "He won't like that." "I know," Tessa said. Gideon emerged as if summoned by the word stubborn. His eyes fixed on Tessa with immediate dislike, as if she were an invoice he couldn't pay. "You were told," he said. Tessa kept her tone level. "I spoke to a bookbinder today," she said. "She recognized your symbol." Gideon's face went still in a way that made Tessa's instincts sharpen. "She didn't say it was yours," Tessa continued, "but she didn't deny you were part of it." Gideon's gaze slid briefly to Ivy, and something passed between them, warning perhaps or exhaustion. Tessa leaned slightly forward. "I want your help," she said. "Because whether you like it or not, your shop is in the middle of this." Gideon's voice dropped. "You don't know what middle means," he said. Tessa almost replied sharply, then noticed something else. The till drawer was open a crack. Inside, among coins and paper, she saw slips, small folded papers with handwriting, not receipts, notes, quotations perhaps. A stack of them, handled often enough that the folds had softened. She also saw, just for a moment, a thin receipt with an odd date stamp. Tomorrow's date, though she couldn't be sure. The details slid past her mind like a fish in murky water. She registered wrong and then moved on because her focus was elsewhere. Ivy saw her glance and quickly slid the drawer shut. Tessa returned to Gideon. "What do you know about a fox holding a key?" she asked. Gideon's mouth tightened. "Nothing worth your time," he said. Tessa let her gaze drift again to the photograph behind the till. This time she saw more clearly. The image was older than she'd first thought. Gideon looked younger, yes, but not merely 2 decades younger. The film grain, the clothing styles, the shop front outside the window, everything suggested a date earlier than Gideon's paperwork implied. The woman beside him in the photo, hair pinned back, laughed with her head slightly tilted, eyes bright. Tessa couldn't see her face fully, but she could see the ease between them. Siblings, perhaps. Partners. People who hadn't yet learned what a locked door could cost. Tessa pointed, lightly, as if it were casual. "Who's she?" she asked. Gideon's face changed. The hostility remained, but something cracked underneath it. A brief flash of pain, quickly covered. "No one you need," Gideon said. That was not how people spoke about no one. Tessa pressed gently, because she had learned the power of a gentle press in a room full of fragile objects. "The thefts began 3 months ago," she said. "That's not random. That's timing. Did something happen here 3 months ago?" Gideon's eyes sharpened to a glare. "Leave," he said. Tessa felt irritation flicker. She'd come too far for a door slammed in her face. "If you keep refusing," she said, "you'll end up being part of the article anyway, and you won't like the version of you that gets printed." Gideon leaned in slightly, voice low enough that the shop itself seemed to hold still. "Some stories are safer unopened," he said again. Tessa met his gaze. "That's not a warning," she said. "That's a threat." Gideon's expression didn't change. "It's advice," he said. Tessa looked at Ivy. Ivy's eyes were on Gideon, and her face held a mixture of frustration and something like fear. Ivy didn't want Tessa to be threatened. Ivy also didn't want her to keep pushing. Tessa made another decision. She stepped back as if conceding. She nodded once. "Fine," she said. "I'll go." Gideon didn't relax. He watched her like a man watching a fire he didn't trust to be out. As Tessa turned, Ivy spoke quietly, the words slipping out as if they'd been waiting behind Ivy's teeth. "If you want proof," Ivy said, "you won't get it from him. You'll get it from the ledger." Gideon's head snapped toward Ivy. "Ivy!" he said sharply. Ivy didn't look at him. Her gaze stayed on Tessa. "Don't ask me how I know," she added. "Just don't do it alone." Tessa's pulse picked up, not from fear, but from the clean thrill of a door opening somewhere in the puzzle. She left the shop without another word, the bell chiming behind her like a clipped laugh. That night, Tessa didn't sleep properly. She lay on her sofa with her laptop open, the corkboard visible across the room, and thought about ledgers. Most small bookshops kept ledgers out of habit, not necessity. The ledger wasn't just accounting, it was memory. Names of customers, titles ordered, returns recorded, a private history written in ink resistant to erasure. If Ivy was right, the ledger held proof. Proof of what, though? That Bramble and Company had sold the stolen books, that they'd flagged them, that someone had been tracking the owners. Or proof of something stranger? Proof that the thefts were being logged like returns, like circulation, like a library system for books that did not want to stay where they belonged. Tessa's phone buzzed around 1 a.m. A message from an unknown number. No greeting, just a single line. "Some stories are safer unopened." The same sentence, the same punctuation, not an exact quote from anything she could recall. Tessa stared at the screen. She told herself it was Gideon trying to intimidate her, or Lucian, if Lucian existed, trying to scare a journalist off a story. It could be any number of people with access to her number. And yet the timing felt curated, placed. Tessa didn't reply. Replying was a kind of agreement. Instead, she opened a new document and began writing her article outline, because writing was how she put fear into boxes. Headline possibilities, subheading options, the hook paragraph she could rewrite later. She wrote FOX and KEY in bold and built bullet points under it like scaffolding. Halfway through, she paused. A line had appeared in the document that she did not remember typing. "Return by Friday 10:14. Tessa stared. She checked her keyboard, she checked her hands, she checked the cursor. The line sat there, plain text, not bold, not italicized. It could have been a stray note she'd typed earlier and forgotten. It could have been a copy-paste accident. It could have been coincidence. Tessa deleted it. Then, after a minute of writing, she found herself typing the same line again without intending to. "Return by Friday 10:14. She stopped, fingers hovering. Her cynicism tried to laugh it off. Deadlines played tricks. Tired minds looped. But the number sat in her mind now like a coordinate. Friday 10:14. A schedule. A return date. She closed her laptop, stood and walked around her flat. She checked the door locks, intact. She checked the windows, closed. She checked her shelves because she'd learned in the last week that people who stole books didn't need to steal anything else. Her shelves were ordinary. Paperbacks, review copies, a few sentimental hardbacks from university. No first editions were theft. Still, she stood in front of them and felt a faint unease, as if the room had become a set and she hadn't been given the script. At 2:30, she went back to her laptop, opened the document, and found the line there again. "Return by Friday 10:14. She didn't delete it this time, and she highlighted it, copied it into her notes, and wrote beside it, "Where have I heard this?" Then, because she couldn't not, she wrote, "Who wants me on a schedule?" On Friday morning, Tessa returned to Bramble and Company before the shop officially opened. The street was quiet, the kind of quiet London only granted for brief intervals between commuter waves. A delivery van idled at a corner, engine grumbling. The sky looked like damp paper. Tessa waited across the road with a coffee she didn't want, watching the shop front like a person staking out a crime scene. She didn't like stakeouts. They felt melodramatic. But she disliked walking blind into another refusal more. At 9:45, Ivy arrived. Tessa recognized her immediately. Pinned hair, alert eyes, the brisk movements of someone used to working in cramped spaces. Ivy unlocked the door, stepped inside, and disappeared behind the curtain. Tessa crossed the road and followed. The bell chimed when she entered. Ivy looked up sharply. Her expression flashed annoyance, then resignation. Tessa kept her voice low. "You told me the ledger," she said. Ivy didn't deny it. She glanced toward the back room as if measuring Gideon's proximity. 5 minutes, Ivy said quietly. "Then you leave." Tessa nodded. She didn't waste breath thanking her. Ivy moved behind the counter, unlocked a drawer, and pulled out a thick ledger bound in dark cloth. She placed it on the counter with care that bordered on reverence. Then she flipped it open to a section where the ink changed. Older entries, handwriting that belonged to another generation. Tessa leaned in. The ledger pages were lined, columns marked in pencil, date, title, customer, status. It looked like any shop ledger until you read the titles. Some were ordinary, some were old, some were written in a hand so neat it felt unnatural. Ivy turned pages quickly, not wanting to linger. Then she stopped at an entry and froze, as if she hadn't expected it to be there so plainly. Tessa followed her gaze. Date, 1976. The exact day smudged, the ink faded. Title, The Index of Quiet Doors, Customer dash dash. Status returned. Notes, Fry 1014/crime, B4/BCCHX001. Tessa's mind snagged hard. The title meant nothing to her and yet felt like it had been written already somewhere in her week, like a line she'd seen in a dream and dismissed. She pointed at it. "That book exists?" she asked. Ivy's face was pale. "It doesn't," she said. Tessa looked at her. "Then why is it in your ledger?" she asked. Ivy's mouth moved as if searching for a sentence that would not get her fired or swallowed by something worse. "Because the ledger doesn't care what's real," she said finally. "It cares what returns." Tessa stared at the entry again. Returned. A book that didn't exist, yet logged as returned decades ago. Tessa felt the room tilt slightly, not physically, but in her understanding of what kind of story she'd been chasing. "This isn't a theft ring," she murmured. Ivy didn't answer. Tessa turned the page, scanning other entries. Her eyes caught repeated marks. Returned beside titles that should not have been returned because they weren't loans. Returned beside dates that didn't match the ink's age. Returned beside the same notes. 1014, crime B4, BCCHX001. A shop keeping records of impossible circulation. Tessa looked at Ivy. "Who writes these?" she asked. Ivy's eyes flicked to the back corridor. "Not me," she said. Tessa glanced again at the photo behind the till, now more visible in the morning light. The woman beside young Gideon, laughing, alive, present in the way photographs sometimes preserve too well. Tessa pointed at the photo without taking her eyes off Ivy. "Her," she said. "Who is she?" Ivy's face changed. "Someone you shouldn't name," she said. Tessa felt a cold clarity settle. "Gideon's sister," she said. Ivy didn't answer, but the silence confirmed it. Footsteps sounded behind the curtain. Ivy snapped the ledger shut, shoved it back into the drawer, and locked it with a speed that suggested habit. Gideon emerged, saw Tessa, and his face hardened into immediate fury. No long speech, no dramatics, just a look that said, "You crossed a line you were warned about." Tessa backed away from the counter, holding her notebook tight against her ribs. She didn't need to provoke him further. She'd already taken what she came for. Gideon's voice was low and clipped. "Out!" Tessa turned and left without argument. Behind her, Ivy didn't speak. The bell chimed as if nothing unusual had happened. Outside, the street looked ordinary. A bus hissed at the curb. A tourist unfolded a paper map with exaggerated confusion. A fox, again real this time, paused near a bin, glanced toward the shop front, and disappeared down an alley with quick elegance. Tessa walked away with the ledger entry burning in her mind. The index of quiet doors, returned, 1976. And the notes, Friday 1014, crime B4, BCCHX001. Her phone buzzed with a new message from her editor, need copy. Also, police asking if you're still on this. Tessa didn't reply. She checked her watch. 10:06, 8 minutes to 10:14. She didn't know what would happen at 10:14, but she knew she was already on the schedule. At 10:14, Tessa was on a train, not because she'd planned it that way, but because London had its own momentum and her instincts had dragged her toward movement. She'd boarded the tube with no clear destination beyond not in my flat and not in that shop. The announcement played over the carriage speakers in a cheery voice that always sounded wrong underground. Mind the gap. The phrase hit her differently now, not as a safety warning, but as a sentence with teeth. The train paused between stations longer than usual, lights flickering once, then stabilizing. People sighed, checked phones, rolled eyes. London's default response to disruption was annoyance. Tessa sat still and watched reflections in the dark window. Her own face, tired and intent. The commuter across from her. A man in a uniform who looked like he'd been awake too long. Paramedic. Raff. She didn't know his name yet, but she recognized the kind of exhaustion, the kind of kindness that made people easy to use. He held a folded slip of paper in his hand, reading it as if it contained instructions. Tessa watched him without staring, a skill learned from interviewing people who didn't want to be studied. The train lurched forward again. The moment passed. The carriage resumed its ordinary noise. But the time, 10:14, sat in her chest like a stamped mark. When she reached her stop, she got off and walked without aim until she realized she'd drifted back toward Charing Cross anyway, as if the city's roots were less about streets and more about repetition. She found herself on the lane behind Bramble and Company without remembering choosing it. Tessa stopped, annoyed with herself. She could have gone home. She could have gone to her office. She could have gone anywhere. Instead, she stood near the shop's back alley and watched the delivery door. A man emerged with a small parcel tucked under his arm. He looked like a courier, but he moved like someone trying not to be noticed. He glanced both ways, then walked briskly toward a parked car. Tessa followed at a distance, keeping her steps casual. The man reached the car, opened the passenger door, and handed the parcel to someone inside. The person inside didn't step out, but Tessa caught a glimpse. An elegant hand, pale, with a gold ring that looked old. A cufflink shaped like something. She couldn't see clearly, but the outline teased a familiar silhouette. Fox. Key. Tessa's pulse quickened. She didn't need to see the face to know she was close to the kind of person who didn't break doors because doors opened for them. The car pulled away smoothly. Tessa followed on foot until the car turned into traffic and vanished. She stood on the pavement and let out a slow breath. Her mind tried to assemble the pieces. Bramble and Company as waypoint, parcels, symbols, ledgers recording impossible returns, thefts curated like chapters. She didn't yet have the name of the person in the car. But she had enough to know that the theft ring was not a gang of opportunists. It was someone with access, patience, and a taste for narrative. Someone who treated London like a book they could reorder. That night, Tessa's flat was not quiet. Not in the sense of sound. London never truly went silent. In the sense that the room felt less hers than it had yesterday, as if it had been visited by attention. She checked her locks again, intact. She checked her windows, closed. She checked her shelves, nothing missing. Then she noticed the notebook on her coffee table. It lay open to a page she hadn't opened, her handwriting visible. She knew her own loops and slants. This wasn't hers. In the margin, near the spine, a tiny drawing sat in faint pencil. A fox holding a key. Tessa stared at it for a long moment. The line was so light it almost vanished if she shifted her head. The placement was precise. The hand was practiced. She didn't feel panic. She felt anger, clean and bright, the kind that made her stand up straighter. Someone had been in her flat. Someone hadn't stolen anything. They had marked her. Her phone buzzed with another message from the unknown number. Chapters need readers. Don't confuse yourself with the author. Tessa read it twice, then set the phone down gently as if it might bite. She went to her laptop and opened her draft again. The line was there at the top of the document, as if it had been waiting. Return by Friday, 10:14. Beneath it, another line now sat, one she hadn't typed, Crime B4. Tessa stared. Her cynical brain tried to insist this was a prank, a hack, an intimidation tactic. Her better brain, the one that had seen the ledger entry in Ivy's hands, recognized the language of systems. Return by, shelf code, printer mark, library logic applied to human lives. Tessa closed the laptop. She went to the kitchen, poured water and drank it slowly, as if rehydration could restore sanity. The water tasted of pipes. She returned to the living room and looked at her notebook again, at the fox and key mark. Then she did something she rarely did when scared. She chose curiosity over retreat. She picked up her coat and keys and left the flat. Bramble and Company was closed when she arrived. The front window was dark, the sign flipped, the street outside almost empty. The bell did not ring because she didn't go through the front door. She went around to the back alley where she'd seen the parcel handoff earlier. She didn't have a key. She didn't force entry. Forced entry was loud, and loud wasn't how these stories worked. Instead, she waited. At 11:20, the back door opened. Ivy stepped out, pulling her coat on as she locked the shop behind her. She jumped slightly when she saw Tessa, then recovered quickly. "You're going to get yourself killed," Ivy said quietly. Tessa's mouth almost curved into a smile, but her nerves refused to permit it. "Is that a promise or a warning?" she asked. Ivy didn't answer. She looked at Tessa's face, then at her notebook in Tessa's hand. Her gaze dropped to the fox and key mark visible on the margin. Ivy's expression tightened. "He stamped you," she said. Tessa didn't correct her. The word stamped felt accurate. "I need to see the crime shelf," Tessa said. Ivy hesitated, then looked toward the door as if weighing how much she could risk. Finally, she unlocked it again. Inside, the shop smelled different at night, cooler, more paper-forward. The stacks of books cast shadows that made the aisles look narrower. Marmalade's eyes glowed briefly from the travel section, then disappeared as he retreated to wherever cats went when humans got dramatic. Ivy led Tessa to the crime shelf by the window, Crime B4. "You've been here before," Ivy said, not accusing, observing. Tessa nodded. "For that article," she said. "I remember this shelf because you told me crime sells better when people are anxious." Ivy's mouth twitched. "That's true," she said. Tessa crouched and scanned the spines. The shelf looked like any other crime shelf. Paperbacks with knives on their covers, detectives with troubled eyes, bridges, basements, bodies in water. Then she saw a paperback tucked slightly deeper than the others, as if something behind it pushed it forward, beneath the bridge. Tessa pulled it out. Inside, on the end paper, was the faint fox and key mark, and beneath it, in pencil so light it looked like a private joke, a phrase, "Mind the gap between stories." Tessa felt a small chill of recognition, not from the phrase itself, but from the way it landed in her mind like a remembered instruction. She flipped the paperback open further and found a thin receipt tucked inside. The date stamp didn't make immediate sense. It was tomorrow. Ivy, standing above her, went still. "That's the slip," she said, voice low. "The one I found weeks ago." Tessa glanced up. "You found it?" she asked. Ivy nodded once, jaw set. "It thanked me for something I hadn't done yet," she said. Tessa stared at the receipt again. In small, neat print, it contained the same bureaucratic poetry she'd seen in the ledger. "Return by Friday, 10:14. Shelf, Crime B4, BCCHX/001. The printer mark, the shelf code, the schedule." Tessa's mind made a clean click. The theft ring wasn't leaving a calling card. It was following a catalogue. The fox and key wasn't a signature of theft. It was a marker of circulation. "Where is Gideon?" Tessa asked. Ivy's face changed, wariness and something like guilt. Downstairs, she said. Tessa looked toward the back corridor, toward the door Ivy had pointed at with her eyes the first time Tessa visited. Is there a ledger down there? Tessa asked. Ivy didn't answer directly. She said instead, some stories are safer unopened. Tessa almost laughed. He taught you that line, she said. Ivy's gaze held hers. I learned it, she said quietly. It's not the same. Tessa stood, receipt in hand. I'm not leaving, she said. Ivy exhaled as if she'd expected that. Then don't make noise, she said. They moved down the corridor. Ivy unlocked the door with the newer lock. Cold air drifted up from below, dry and metallic. Tessa went down the stairs with care. She wasn't afraid of basements. She was afraid of being wrong in basements. The room below was not storage. It was a library built into stone, shelves lined with older volumes that looked as if they'd been collected by someone who both loved and feared them. A glass dome sat on a table, under it something wrapped in cloth. A fox holding a key hung framed on the wall like a brand. And at the table stood Gideon Bramble, Marion Lark, and the paramedic from the train, Raff, looking as if he'd wandered into someone else's nightmare and decided to stay anyway. No one spoke for a moment. Tessa's presence landed like an unexpected chapter break. Gideon's face hardened immediately. Marion's expression tightened with irritation. Raff looked startled, then oddly resigned, as if strangers appearing in strange rooms had become normal. Ivy said nothing. She simply stepped aside, letting Tessa's presence speak for itself. Tessa took in the objects quickly. The shelves, the dome, the cloth-wrapped stamp, the seam in the stone floor that looked too clean to be accidental. Her journalist brain wanted to catalogue it all. Her human brain wanted to back up the stairs and pretend she'd never seen a private library under a modest shop. Instead, she focused on what she'd come for. The Index of Quiet Doors, she said, voice steady. The words hung in the air. Raff flinched slightly, as if the title tugged at something in his skull. Marion's eyes flicked to Tessa with new attention. Gideon's face drained of color in a way that made anger look like a second emotion. Tessa held up her notebook, showing the fox and key mark. Someone came into my flat and drew that, she said. If you want me out of this, you should have kept your system from leaking. Gideon looked like he might speak, then didn't. Marion's voice came out flat, practical. You shouldn't have come, she said. Tessa looked at her. I shouldn't have been marked, she replied. Raff shifted, eyes tired. He looked at Tessa and then at the stone seam in the floor, as if he was trying to decide which was worse, a person with a notebook or a door that acted like a schedule. Tessa's gaze dropped to the seam. That's under the shop, she said. No one corrected her. That was confirmation enough. Tessa felt her cynicism collide with something heavier, responsibility. If she walked away now, she could write nothing, publish nothing, pretend she'd never learned that books could be used as coordinates. But she already had a fox and key in her notebook. Pretending would not erase graphite. You're stealing signed first editions, she said, aiming the accusation at the room rather than a person. Or someone is, and they're doing it like they're assembling chapters. Marion's mouth tightened. They're collecting anchors, she said. Tessa stared at her. Anchors, she repeated. Marion didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. Tessa understood the metaphor enough to be unsettled by it. Gideon finally spoke, voice low. This isn't your story, he said to Tessa. Tessa's mouth curved slightly, humorless. Someone drew in my notebook, she said. That makes it mine whether you like it or not. Gideon's eyes flashed, anger and fear braided. This story eats people, he said. Tessa looked at the shelves and thought of the theft victims' libraries, all those rooms edited without permission. She thought of the ledger entry for a book returned decades ago. She thought of the future-dated slip in her hand. I don't think it eats, she said quietly. I think it circulates. The words felt correct in her mouth, as if she'd read them somewhere. Raff looked at her sharply, as if he'd heard the same thought in his own head before. Tessa held up the receipt from the crime paperback. "This is a library system pretending to be a shop," she said. "Return by Friday 10/14, crime B4, BCCHX/001. She looked at Gideon. "That's not theft, that's logistics." Gideon's face tightened. Marion looked away, jaw set. Ivy stood very still. Tessa understood then that she was not walking into a conspiracy. She was walking into a mechanism, and mechanisms did not care about intentions. They cared about tension. She looked again at the fox and key emblem on the wall. Not decorative, declarative. "Who is Lucian?" she asked, the name arriving in her mind with no clear source. The room reacted, not with words, with minute shifts. Gideon's shoulders stiffening, Ivy's breath changing, Marion's eyes sharpening, Raff's expression flickering into recognition of a face he hadn't met but had perhaps heard described. Tessa didn't push further. She didn't need a confession to know she'd named the kind of person who liked being unnamed. She slipped her notebook back under her arm. "I'm going to write this story," she said. Gideon's face twisted. "You'll get people hurt," he said. Tessa met his gaze. "People are already hurt," she replied. "You just hid the ledger." Silence held the basement for a moment, heavy and old. Then Ivy spoke quietly to Tessa, as if offering the only mercy available. "If you write it," she said, "write it so it can't be used." Tessa looked at her. "How?" she asked. Ivy's eyes flicked to the shelves. "Leave out the coordinates," she said. Tessa almost smiled. "That's not journalism," she said. "It's survival," Ivy replied. Tessa took that in. She didn't promise anything. Above them, the shop was closed. The street outside carried on. Somewhere in the city, a thief or a curator was choosing the next signed first edition to remove from a shelf. Tessa thought of her editor's deadline. Monday. A story ready to be printed. She imagined printing as another kind of return. A story released into the world could not be recalled. She looked at the receipt again, tomorrow's date, Friday 10/14, and felt the uncomfortable suspicion that time itself had been filed in this shop's ledger. Tessa slipped the receipt into her notebook. She wasn't sure whether she was collecting evidence or being collected. When she left the basement and stepped back into the narrow, dusty warmth of Bramble and Company, she felt the shop's ordinary details with a different awareness. The bell, the ladder, the crime shelf, the stacks. All of it was a facade over a system that had been running longer than her career, longer than Gideon's paperwork, longer than anyone's comfort. Outside, rain began again, fine, persistent, like graphite dust settling. Tessa walked into it and didn't look back. She had her headline now, but the question was no longer whether she could publish. The question was whether publication was another way of opening a door, and whether once opened, any of them would be able to pretend it was just a story.